You guys ready? All right, let's do it. So just a reminder, we're going to plug our sudo talks. This is a new webinar series we're doing. I think there's another actual webinar in 2 weeks. And I'm going to try and pull that up while I'm narrating a little bit about sudo talks, but we just wanted to give a forum for you all to ask us questions, to talk to you about relevant topics, current standing of things, you know, anything really that would help you all and let you guys and gals engage with us. So we're really excited for the launch of these sudo talks. I think the next one is called, I'll pull it up on the screen if I can. It's called Identity Management for Macs Going Beyond Active Directory with Manny and Renako. You can sign up for it. I'm going to send the webinar link in the chat right now. And yeah, so this is our second of the series. The first one was about virtualization with macOS specifically, and that's available. You can just go and watch it. It's ungated, I'm pretty sure. So if you want to see how to test and evaluate Macs, do cool things with them, definitely check it out. But this is the second series. Super excited about this one, and let's get right into it. So this webinar is actually titled Ask a Hacker with Ralph Echamendia. Super happy to have you here, Ralph. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here, man.
And you know, we really want to make sure you guys ask whatever you want, and we're going to try and answer. We actually sent out a questionnaire, I think, with the webinar. If you had questions and you wanted to send in advance, we actually had quite a few questions submitted, and we'll be talking through those by and large for the beginning of this webinar. And then after that, we'll open up just any questions you all may want to ask in the chat, in the question and answer section in the webinar tool. Feel free to ask them there as well. We're happy to answer anything through any of those mediums. So with that said, my name is Nicholas Ponce. I lead the operations and security teams here at Addigy. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and slideshow order here. So Nathan, you want to give it a quick?
My name is Nathan Pavon, and I am an application security engineer here at Addigy.
And I'm Ralph Echamendia, known as the Ethical Hacker, and I've been working in the field of cybersecurity now for 29 years. So I've gone through everything from penetration testing and forensics to you name it. So there's a lot we can talk about.
Awesome. Thank you both for doing the intros. You know how we love introductions here. But you know, I think one thing I would like to say is we have the pleasure or the luxury of being able to ask Ralph, pretty much ask him anything, or an AMA kind of all the time. We wanted to give everybody else that ability, that opportunity to kind of ask Ralph any sort of questions they may have, anything that we may be able to answer as well. So yeah, that's kind of, you know, what we're here for and what we wanted to talk about. So let's get right into it. We actually I mentioned we had a few questions. I'm going to go over some of them now, but if you're listening to us talk and you have questions, feel free to send them in the Q&A section in the webinar or the chat. We'll be happy to answer both, but we're probably going to be monitoring the Q&A a little bit more. So I guess Ralph, if it's cool, I know we took a look at some of the questions already. Let's start from the top.
Yeah, let's do it.
You know, what would
ask away?
What would you recommend, or what would we recommend as a good security toolkit stack for macOS and iOS management? Is the question from Jeffrey. So very good question. You know, obviously, I'm pretty sure Jeffrey is an Addigy customer, so he's using Addigy. And I'm going to start this one off, Ralph, and kind of segue into you. But
yes, please.
We actually have a KB article with like step-by-step instructions and and it references community scripts to do a lot of this stuff, is some of our recommended security configurations for macOS devices. It's mainly based off NIST SPF guide, but there's a lot of things here that you can do to strengthen or harden the devices, the macOS devices, like enabling file vault, making sure you're using an MDM for lock and device, enabling the firewall, disabling remote login, remote management, antivirus, anti-malware. And you could take this stuff to another level, like a next-gen antivirus, a SIM, a whole bunch of different things, right? We've historically talked about this firewall really being a one-way firewall into the machine, but not necessarily what a firewall monitoring external connections, right? And this is mainly just Mac OS, right? And here's a step-by-step of how to actually configure these things. And it's pretty straightforward, and a lot of the work is in the community, so you could just copy it over. But this is just one way of strengthening the Mac OS device, and we're not even talking about iOS there. So, Ralph, I guess, is there anything else you would recommend? Maybe Nathan, if you want to chime in too, anything else you would recommend from Mac OS, iOS perspective to kind of help with security?
I think Nicholas, that document you just showed, and I think it's a good idea if you post that in the chat, the link to that, so that everybody has it. Is a pretty thorough document on how to harden your devices and your configurations. When you start talking about, you mentioned in the question was, Mac OS management overall. Obviously, as a Addigy customer, you already have a tool that that others don't necessarily have for managing the environment, right? Then all of these things come into play, so that have just been mentioned before. And then you have other pieces of software, right, that people may think is, are useful, right? Like Little Snitch, and there's a question that we saw about keylogging and so on. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think you start with a document like this, in ensuring that your configurations, because that tends to be sort of the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to getting hacked, is that there is a misconfiguration somewhere that has been hardened, or that certain settings haven't been turned on. So that sort of thing is all covered here, and there's not really much more to add to it since it's pretty thorough.
Yeah, and to your point, like Little Snitch is a paid solution. There are other solutions out there. We've done a few webinars now with Patrick Wardle, who runs Objective by the Sea conference. Yeah, Objective C and Objective by the Sea conference, and he has a bunch of open source tools that kind of give you that type of granularity. You can also do it with Addigy. You can also use a tool called Santa. We actually have a KB article out there for Santa. It's also open source, free, and it actually comes with, if you type in Santa, the first thing you'll usually get is the Google Santa tracker. That's usually not the time of year we were searching for this, but you can just type Santa Addigy. And they usually have like predefined packs, for blocking things or implementing security controls. But part of this is the question that that Jeff asked, is like, what would we recommend as good security, right? And that's a bit ambiguous, right, Ralph and Nathan? I would say, like,
yeah, no doubt.
Good security is really varies upon, like, who you're trying to protect and what their needs are, and how much they're willing to balance that usability versus security trade-off, right? And we talked about that a lot, right?
That's a good point, because for example, tools such as these last few that we just mentioned, from Little Snitch to Santa, is the thing is that you have to keep in mind that it also creates another layer of support, really, right? I mean, the security can get in the way of functionality, and you have to balance functionality with security. You can't really put it ahead of functionality without affecting functionality, right? So you have to be careful to what degree you log things down that they can affect functionality and become a tech support issue for the security group.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Nathan, we deal with this quite a bit, right? Like even internal users, right? Like not too many of them want to go through more hoops to get their job done, right?
Mhm.
But we also want to make them more secure, or
Yeah,
secure the people, right?
one thing that we annoy people with is the session timeout with Google. So
Yeah,
much so that
Mm-hmm.
it's become kind of like a meme in the company. That it's like, oh, I got ponцed
yeah,
when we get
Yeah,
like booted off Slack or whatever. But we do that
yeah,
because if you keep sessions open for too long, like that just increases the risk of someone unauthorized gaining access to it. Like if you're in a cafe, for example, you just leave your laptop on,
yeah,
things like that. So
yeah.
yeah, it's gonna be like inconvenient to a lot of users, but it's your company. It's like your company is on the line here, so you gotta make some
yeah,
compromises.
yeah. Security takes compromises, you know. It always does, right? And it's just a matter of getting used to it. There are going to be people kicking and screaming sometimes, uh, but usually once everybody gets kind of accustomed to having to do things a certain way, very quickly they forget the ways that they used to do it. You know, so it's a normal thing for that to happen. It's just initially getting that adoption can be uh, you know painful.
And to you guys' point, sometimes they, especially with certain companies or users, they don't want to do that, right? They don't want to do these. They don't want to have these controls, right? Like ultimately, these are security controls. This isn't security per se. We're just implementing controls on the devices so they are more secure. I sent two links in the chat just now with the CIS kind of benchmarks for macOS and iOS.
Mhm.
And usually what we've seen firsthand is that if you go and try and apply all those benchmarks that CIS says you to do, the device may not even be usable by the end user. They may not even be able to get their job done, which is
Yep.
is important too, right? They still need to get their job done. So, I would say, because I see some questions here, do we have recommendations? And I would say, like, what we usually do is evaluate the recommendations that CIS and NIST give us, and then we make the recommendations out of that. Now, depending on your compliance framework, you may need to implement certain controls that just really disrupt end users, and that's really challenging. But that doesn't mean you can't do it or you won't do it. Sometimes you have to make that user sign off on something if you have to bypass them for certain things. But yeah, definitely, I think that's a good checklist to start, is comparing the CIS framework to what you actually want to apply and what's realistic for your organization or organizations. Because that gives you kind of what tools you will need to implement said security controls, right? Which, yeah, it's hard to pick the tools if you don't know what checkboxes you're trying to check off. All right,
Well, Nicholas, I can't for some reason. I don't see any of the questions from the. I only see your responses in my chat.
there's
So
another
if there's
section
a
actually, questions. Maybe that's it. Maybe,
Yeah, there's a certain drop down for
yeah.
questions.
I've
okay.
been talking in the chat, but let me actually send this to the quick Q&A section here.
Either way, you could just relay the questions. One of the other questions was about, given the current threat landscape on Mac OS, specifically Mac OS. Okay, so what are the suggestions to improve security posture? And this goes to the last question. A lot of the things that we just discussed right now when it comes to deployments, as far as improving security posture. are in some of these documents that we just mentioned, and some of the things we're talking about now. But again, that has to be something it's very unique and specific to the organization and what they do in their business. Because as Nicholas mentioned, if you were to really do everything that is being said, then chances are, the most secure computer is one that's not connected to anything, but it's also not very usable.
Yeah.
So it's again reaching that balance for your organization, for that, or that specific use case, right? Obviously, somebody in say human resources, there's a different threat level to say somebody in finance, to somebody in IT, right? So even within the departments, sometimes you have different configurations depending on the level of security that you want and what risks are really involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this actually goes into some of the questions we have that came after. I'm not sure what order these questions came in, but I think that, how vulnerable, like the question we were talking about at length was how vulnerable are Mac devices to lateral movement, and this goes like to the same kind of context of like, what is the number one security suggestion? And it goes back to like connecting the devices to the internet, like you said. Really, it starts there, right? So like once the device is connected to the internet, anything pretty much goes. So what are you doing, or what are we doing to secure those devices, right? Are we implementing those macOS security recommendations? Because that definitely limits the lateral movement that a Mac could face, right? Like I know we see a lot of lateral movement on Windows devices, just the nature of things, right? Because
Active Directory.
they're connecting to Active Directory. They usually have shares enabled that can allow anybody on that AD to like access another machine's file share. If you have a domain admin credential that gets exposed, now any device that's on that same network or private network can then talk to it. And if they have shared credentials, then, or Active Directory domain credentials, then they're definitely a target. But macOS doesn't really have this threat vector, right? Like it does, but not definitely at the same extent, and definitely not as easily accessible as a Windows Active Directory component.
Yeah, so I would say that it's a lower of it's less vulnerable from the perspective of for lateral movement, right? Also, if you were on a network as a hacker and you're now kind of scanning the network to determine what other devices you can get access to, right? This is not necessarily the greatest box to pivot from or to get access to just for the purpose of pivoting, right? You're better off with either some Windows machines or other Unix-based machines that chances are going to be less less accessible, right, than the Mac OS system in general. Again, it could certainly be used, but it isn't a preferred device for lateral movement.
Yeah, and on that note, I think that the next question here is and this is a really good one, Ralph, and I see you've been looking at it. Is how do you balance time for doing normal work activities and keeping up with cyber topics?
That's a really good question, and it really is a matter of kind of setting yourself up to have a schedule where you spend X amount of time, doing research and continuing to stay on top of, what is out there, right? I would tend to, everybody has their own way of doing it. Some people like to work different hours, right? But for me, it's usually like in the morning or very late in the evening or research hours and research time, just to be looking at things, while kind of in the middle, you get things that you have to get done. And that tends to work out with just everybody's schedule. I happen to travel a lot, and so I'll be in multiple time zones, but I kind of stick to, sort of my scheduling, even if it runs into really odd hours, depending on where I am, right? But that tends to be how I do it. And you have to kind of have the discipline to build your schedule out kind of that way, because you know that a certain part of the day is almost always going to be just dealing with work, and the rest of that time is going to be, making sure you're up to date on what's happening.
Yeah, and that's like I think it's more challenging, I want to say, and the question that this was asked from in the perspective is like, as an IT administrator, how do I keep up with all these crazy cyber topics that it's
Mm-hmm.
not even my expertise, Ralph, or like that's not my skill set. So like as like an IT admin that I'm trying to get my job done, and security is, for better or for worse, I think it is tied a lot back to IT, right? Like especially
Yeah,
endpoint
absolutely.
security, right? Like do you have any recommendations on like managing that? Because right, like that's like trying to manage two separate jobs. You by and large, and Nathan by and large probably are most of the time heads down in security stuff, right?
Yeah,
But if you're
yeah,
not heads down in security stuff, and on top of that, like you're being tasked to manage security things, right? Like, what are things that can help you scale, right? I have a few ideas. Like, I know, I know there's some like antivirus vendors that actually provide a SOC with their service,
mm-hmm.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
then, like, you have the antivirus tool, and then you actually have, a 24/7 security operations center of people watching for security related events. So that way you don't have to manage it all the time, especially at least on the endpoint side. And you get alerted about those security issues, and you can action on them, but it's not taking and consuming all your time. But that still doesn't cover like, like Log4j and
Right,
Silver
right.
Sparrow and all these huge cyber things that also require attention, right? So like there's scaling like your role responsibility, but there's also like handling all this 24/7 nonstop incoming security world, right? Like, like there's a new vulnerability, a new 0 day, like every day, right? Google Chrome, you know,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
there's something
Yeah.
new every day, and it's really hard to keep track of, just from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the easiest, because to your point, is first of all, your system and network administrators are almost always, regardless, sort of stuck with having to deal with security. They can, in most cases, rarely just be purely the system network admin anymore, right? It just becomes part of what they do. Now, from a technical, you mentioned one way. There's a lot of solutions now from sort of security as a service tools out there that you can use. Um, that'll scan your perimeter, right, if it's coming from the outside. And then when you're dealing with the inside, vulnerability scanning is really one of the easiest, if you will, ways for a sysadmin, a network admin, to have to deal with, uh, sort of staying on top of things. And there's still, as Nicholas mentioned, certain things that are not going to necessarily be found through these tools, right? And they take their own time for you to determine what's false positives and false negatives out of that. But once you do it, you're doing it enough, you get to understand your environment enough. That's probably one of the most simple ways for you to know, oh, okay, well, this box hasn't been updated, or it has these ports open, or it has these services, that may be a vulnerability, or even just for you to have the question to be able to go to the business unit and say, well, why does this box need to have FTP ports open? You know, um, and either make that service a secure service, or just completely disable it altogether, right? But understanding your environment is really it, and nobody understands it better than the sysadmins. That's the truth. The
Mm.
security guys, they understand security, but they don't really understand the day-to-day operations necessarily as well as the sys and the network admins do. So, that's probably what I would say is that where you can use technology to help you with your timing and schedule around how do you even keep up, because there is no way to keep up. It is really that much going on
Mhm.
that there's no way for you to keep up, especially if your focus and your area of expertise is really in the operational side of things, as opposed to security specific side of things. So yeah, scan the hell out of all your devices, and then follow those, uh, depending on what's found there, do your research on those things, right? But yeah, it's just impossible to wear both hats, and too often that's the case. Is that you're having to wear multiple hats as a sysadmin or network admin.
And I mean, to be fair though, a lot of the hat we wear today indirectly results in making the devices more secure, right? For managing the devices and hardening them and keeping software up to date, then theoretically that should mitigate a lot of the things we say that need to be done, right? But then there's also, do you have an antivirus tool? Do you have a SIM? Are you monitoring these things, or who's monitoring these things, right? Or the security operations center, and if you don't have one, like, are you monitoring any security events or alerting on them, or etc. So
what kind of visibility do you have over your environment? And that's, I will say, and you've heard me say this before, Nicholas, that I think that the management, what we call system management, is really a security function, right? Because it begins there, right? I mean, okay, if you just take a machine, server, box, whatever you want straight out of the box and plug it in, chances are you're gonna be pretty. That's a risky thing to do, no matter what kind of box it is, without you locking it down to what it's needed for, right? And that is really management, right? Like, I mean, going back to, I started in management. I was a system administrator as far as before there was any even the use of the word security in IT. So the thing is, ultimately, that is where it begins. Security does begin at proper management of the environment. And from there it goes into other things and all the other tools that you might be using, firewalls, antivirus, blah, 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 right? But at the end of the day, I remember spending, an enormous amount of time back in the day choosing to compile a specific version of Linux to my specific hardware, right? That's some hacker shit to do, just because I want to make sure that nothing that is not needed on this box is loaded at all. So I had to go spend 3 or 4 days compiling a Linux, distribution.
Was it Gentoo?
Yeah, Gentoo. Yep.
Okay. Yep.
So, days just getting an operating system to be up and running, because I want that box to purely do only that, right? And so that is really a management function, and really at the roots of security, I would say is system management.
Yeah, 100%. And we've actually been getting some really good questions coming in that I kind of want to segue into here really quickly.
You shoot, because I can't see them on my chat for whatever reason. So
I got you. So one was the CIS benchmark is not secure. Thank you, Victor. Yeah, I mean, they're basing their recommendations on what you should do to harden it. I don't know if it defines security, right? But it's a starting point, I think, for most people, definitely. Here's one that I really wanted to bring up, which I have application developers with Macs who need sometimes to have local admin rights. We deal with this on Windows 10 users by using run as when they need those rights. Do we have a way for Mac users? So I sent a KB article there. I think everybody might have it, but I'm gonna send the links here. I sent 2 links. One is a tool called Privileges by some of the Mac community that allows users to get temporary admin rights. The other option is something that actually one of our end users did to give temporary admin access through Addigy, which was pretty cool. You can obviously thank Ross for that. He gave us the workflow, and we created the KB article, and I'm pretty sure he uses this regularly. So that just goes along the lines of, like, do I need a admin on every machine, right? Do I have my own IT admin account that is like, domain admin, if you will, essentially is like the same username and password across the board, or maybe we rotate some of those credentials. But, do you really need, like, obviously I'm pretty sure there needs to be one admin on macOS, at least in certain contexts, but do you really need an admin or an IT admin on your machine to manage the devices? And you know, my first thought is no, you don't as much these days. But there are some things that standard users can't do, and there'll need to be an administrator that does that action. Um, Now, who's the standard user and who's the admin, and where those admins are obviously different per company. Um, so, you know, I know there's probably a lot of different opinions on this, but curious, do you guys have any feedback on, you know, on local admin rights, maybe giving local admin rights to an IT admin or a domain admin, and, you know, what the ramifications of that is?
I really like this other question here that we had about how do hackers use different vectors for IT professionals compared to end users? Now, it doesn't really matter, right? As long as it works, that's the point. But the difference is that with IT professionals, chances are that you're using in many cases it's actually the the footprint is larger, right, with IT professionals than the actual just employees, right? The person working at HR or finance only has access to these systems, but IT professionals have access to a lot more systems with a higher, with higher level of access, right? So it tends to be getting an idea. For example, we give a lot of information up on LinkedIn. That's the first thing I would do, is to find out if I'm targeting somebody at, say, Addigy. Okay, what do they use? What kind of technologies are they using? And that is a big piece of the puzzle, right? If I'm targeting, and who's who. And a lot of that information is public knowledge, right? So you can paint a pretty good picture before you determine what vectors to go after, right? But with IT professional, it tends to be a broader set of vectors. So
Yeah, and they definitely have more access, right? Like more of that admin access than
absolutely.
a standard user. That, like, if a standard user, like if someone, I know we have a question here on phishing, right? What
Mm-hmm.
happens when someone gets phished? But like if it's just a general user getting phished, it's a lot smaller scope than the IT admin, and maybe he was on with like a domain admin credential, or you know, a workspace admin credential, and now, you know, the scope is a lot bigger. Um,
Yep. And to what you were previously talking about before too, a lot of that has to, again, visibility, right? And logging. You can actually have whatever it is that you're doing, that ultimately you have visibility over that environment. That's critical. And one of the things that, again, we have to kind of configure for to ensure that everything that you need to see, you can see.
yeah, and here's another question that we kind of talked about earlier, but we're definitely it's definitely like a lot of this conversation is about around security, but I think this one definitely approaches the privacy context, right? Which is, my customers often ask me if I can detect if they're being spied on, or a keylogger has been added to their Mac after a phishing attack. How do I find out if their keystrokes are being tracked, if they're being spied on, aside from the typical malware and extension cleanup?
Well, that's, keyloggers are a few things. So, one is looking, and again, having knowledge of that, looking at activity monitor to see what is being used, what process, right? If you do it by process, to determine, what is being done, right? Like the terminal or any of these type of services that could be run. And you can open up a terminal and type in, man, for example, network D or whatever, and see what it does in the activity monitor, so that you can have an idea of what processes are running. That's one way. Obviously, these are all ways that, if there is no hardware, right? If this is not a hardware keylogger, right? If it's the other is, if there's software key, if you believe that you have software that is actually logging your keys, then you can bring up that little keyboard from your the virtual keyboard. Anything you type in there obviously is not being potentially stored by the keylogger, but that doesn't mean that you're detecting it. It's just if you believe, if you're that But you want to make sure that when you're typing in this password, it's not potentially being grabbed. But again, most of the, really detecting that the use of a keylogger really lies with what files are being used, what processes are running, right? So, and you can, like I said, do certain things to thwart a keylogger if you think that there's a keylogger on there. But ultimately, the true only best way is to wipe the machine and start from scratch, right? Because you don't know if a certain malware is doing it, right? Again, there are little techniques you can use if you want to be extra secure. For example, open up Notepad and or any kind of writing thing you can put this into, and start typing in the password, then write a bunch of characters in Notepad, and then go back and finish the password. Obviously, that would somewhat thwart if there was a keylogger, they wouldn't be getting your password. But keyloggers are a difficult thing because they could be installed in a couple of different ways, and but again, typically it's part of some sort of other malware.
Yeah. Yeah, we already talked about Patrick's Wardow's site, but he actually has a product called Oversight that shows if someone's activated your microphone or camera. So if you're worried about being spied on from that perspective, that might help. You can also monitor the launch daemons and launch agents. We actually default facts for that in Addigy. You can install some tools to monitor that stuff. Usually, like if it's a keylogger, it's a persistent threat. It's going to stay there for a while. So that should show up in those components, and you can monitor for that type of stuff. And like if a new, you can set up really easily in Addigy a monitor on the launch daemon, launch agent facts if it changes. And if it changes, that means something probably got installed that is going to run persistently on your machine. You may want to be aware of it. All right. I'd say maybe the next question we can answer is this one. Exactly how safe is a current Mac as compared to previous OS X versions?
I mean, I would say that obviously every newer version of Mac tends to be safer than the previous version by a whole lot. They tend to be very good about addressing a lot of issues from the previous versions. In fact, I'm sure you've all noticed that you have a new version of Mac OS come out, and literally sometimes in a matter of days, you've got some updates, right, to that. So they're very good about that. And if you're running like a much older version of Mac OS, usually I find that a lot in Hollywood, where they don't want to, run an update of the operating system because they're running some piece of software, for video editing or rendering or whatever they're doing, and they can't stop in that process. And so so oftentimes I find that networks like that, which are mostly on for creative use, tend to be on older versions of Mac OS, and of course, more than not, more often I can get into those machines because they haven't been patched properly. So there's known exploits and no vulnerabilities that can be taken advantage of. So I mean, the newest versions of Mac OS and iOS are always tend to be better from a security perspective. I mean, patching still is kind of a, I don't know, I would say the number one thing, but it is a major issue, right? If you're not keeping up to date with patches is what we're looking for.
Yep. I would even say sometimes the new operating systems, when they are first released, sometimes have 0 days, right, to your point. And sometimes updating too early is also problematic. I would say by and large, as it's the newest OS on the latest build, aside, is usually the best way to go, unless it's usually the first build out there, because then it's it could be problematic, and you have to apply some 0 days. So if you have been paying attention to kind of what Apple has done since, I want to say, High Sierra, is they've gotten extremely heavy-handed on the privacy and security components. They implemented the privacy preference policy control. They implemented the new chipset, which resolves several security vulnerabilities at the hardware level. So, you know, by and large, they're going to be doing more and more to make our lives more challenging from a security perspective, because it's protecting the end user. And when I say that, because you know, I don't know how many times I've seen people complain to me where it's like, I can't just remote control into the computer. The end user has to approve it, right?
Yeah.
And well, as an IT admin, that's annoying when you need to connect in and help the end user. From an end user perspective, that's super helpful from a privacy security standpoint. Now, not anybody can just jump into my machine and connect to it and watch what I'm doing, like they could in Windows, and they still can. So, yeah, I like, to your point, I think just every new OS is going to be more secure and more privacy focused. And what that means for us as IT admins means more responsibilities of things we're going to have to help manage and help the user, not just, you know, whitelist, but educate them on, because now they're getting prompts of things they've never seen before that they don't understand why, and so on and so forth. And getting ingrained kind of into the company, if you will, from an IT perspective, really helps in that perspective, because you can directly help, like, the engineers understand things, the other team members in the company understand, like, why this is there, how it's protecting you, how the device tools you're using to manage these devices are also limited, so that, like, it goes back to that question, how can you assure someone that they're not being spied on or being tracked to the best extent possible? Well, that's how. Next question, what are some key things as an IT support personnel should be keeping an eye out for when supporting end users with phishing emails and links they have clicked on and provided information in? This is a really good one. I don't know how many times I've heard someone say, even my own family members say, I clicked the link, I shouldn't have clicked, I don't know what to do now, help please.
Yeah. What now? What do I do? I did click on it. I did
Probably
it.
everybody on this call has at least gotten that once. I don't know if you guys want to say in chat that, you know, if it's happened to you before, please share. But, you know, someone came to us and said, I clicked the link. You know, what do we do, Ralph? Like, what are the steps to unwind the mess that may have been created?
Usually it's, Mom, I told you not to click on any links. Okay. How many times do I have to tell you? Well, I mean, obviously, depending if it's not a phishing thing that you're doing as part of training, because then obviously those are things that you control. But obviously, you know, you're concerned about what kind of information they've been giving up, right? Which the most common of that being email address and password, right? That's really the, you know, at the most common thing that we're going after. But identifying what kind of information was being requested is key. We know that that's the most common is those two data fields, but you know, it could be a number of other things, right? And that helps us to determine what they may be going after, right? And of course, for most of us, if we're dealing with one of these cases, then it's going to be to lock down that account, and to whatever level we can is to monitor that account for attempted access, right? So that we have an idea for where the attack is coming from or where they may be attempting to. But you know, the most common thing that I see that doesn't happen is to identify really what that phishing email looked like, or what the link where led to, what kind of information it was trying to gather from the user, beyond what typically is just the username and password.
Yeah, and I see quite a bit of feedback already about people. You know, someone says this happens 3 times a day, and regardless of training, you know, and that's a big component of it, right? Training, and you know, there's a bunch of tools out there that help do phishing simulation, like KnowBe4. There's open source ones called like OpenFish or something like that. I'll have to link it here in the chat.
Yeah. Let me find it.
And there's some really good Google training on phishing, but training, you know, I think training really only helps if you're doing simulations like these tools do, where they get an email, they may click the email. I've noticed that, and I'm sure some of you on this call can relate, where it's even technical users that fall for it, right? It's not just
Oh yeah,
the moms and the grandmas, right? So I have to tell my mom and my grandma, like, hey, it's okay. This happens to everybody. It's like on the internet, I tell them you can look, but you can't touch, right? Like don't touch anything, because like if you don't know what you're doing, something bad might happen. And
Yep.
the know before training that we use, like it gives us reports on who clicked it, allows us to dedicate training towards them. They have to take more phishing training, things like that. But going back to kind of what to do once they click it, I've seen is like it's best to try and get as much information from them as possible, right? Usually the people that click it don't want to give that much information. They just feel really bad about it happening.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to share like what happened. Like if it's a text message, or like it hacked your Instagram or whatever it is, right? Like I tend to find getting as much information as help is the best way to help, because without that information we can't help. And we don't, like, we could say shut down your PC, but like if it was a online account that was compromised, then our shutting down our PC really won't help all that much, right? So there's a
Yeah, I mean the training, and it's really it's a matter of integrating into your company's culture, if you will, security as a thing, or safety, right? And a lot of it has to do with how you interact with your user base, right? Because again, security is that thing we don't really want to deal with. Most people don't really want to deal with. So you have to kind of change the way that you address it. I mean, I have found that oftentimes when somebody makes those kind of mistakes, and I'm looking into it, I need to turn it into as if it was a good thing, because it's data for me to track them down, or for me to learn about their attack vector usage. So I try to like, no, that was great. That's great, because that's going to help me, and immediately take the attention off of them feeling foolish. And that's something that we have to, as technology people here, we have to learn to do better. Because oftentimes, our user base will tend to feel like we're talking down to them. And that's not helpful to us, right? Not helpful to us making the environment safer. And I've dealt with that in many cases where it was just like, the way that they spoke to, in some forensic cases, the way that they were speaking to the investigators versus the way they were speaking to me had a lot to do with just the interaction that I made, that I made them feel more open to telling me what they did, right? Or, how much information they put in. Because to Nicholas's point, oftentimes they want to keep from saying much, because they feel like, oops, I screwed up. So, yeah, I screwed up. That's as much as I want to tell you. Now I clicked on the link. Yeah, I put in the email, whatever. But they tend to just really limit, because they're feeling, like I said, as you're, they're going to be talked down to. So, I'd say use it in some enthusiasm as if it was a good thing, because now you can make it better, right? As opposed to making them feel like you fucked up.
Yeah. So there's been a couple of good questions here that I want to get to before the end of the session here. So what are our thoughts on zero trust? Do you guys have any thoughts on zero trust? I have mine, but I'll let you guys go first on this
one. This is an interesting concept, right? And obviously I would say that, yeah, it's a good idea, if you will. The whole thing is its implementation is always, that's what I always find to be an issue, right? I think it's again, implementing this into your environment, I think is a good idea. This model, this premise, to not blindly trust anything is a good idea. But I mean, I've always been, I think we just put a name to something that would really is sort of, for me, always has been standard operating procedure. You know, I'm not gonna allow access to anything unless you've provided a business justification for doing that, right? And everything else is blacklisted. You know, I've always worked kind of that way when it comes to whatever services, right? And then digging even further into the services. So I think it's really kind of the same thing, right? The more that we've kind of segmented certain aspects of our technology solutions, you know, better. We have better controls over identity service and, you know, how endpoints can access certain applications and the network itself and network resources and, you know, SaaS and cloud, you know, resources. But ultimately, all those things are really a bunch of rules that should only always be allowing what is defined as being trustworthy, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I like it goes back to like, you know, kind of who polices the police, right? Or like it's like SSO, right? Like setting and I see, you know, Victor was talking quite a bit about changing passwords when you get phished and right like that one password managers, right? We should all be using password managers, not using the same password. So even if that password does get compromised, it's not the end of the world. But right, like the whole movement towards SSO is so that we don't have people entering they use the same username and password across the board, and it actually makes it easier for them to sign in with less friction, right? But what happens in the case of like Okta, that Okta got breached, right? And now they have access to the entire SSO platform, and they can SSO into whatever resource they want, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, I think zero trust in terms of device management isn't as bad as that in terms of like an SSO portal. It actually gives you a little bit more segregation in terms of like the components, but I think zero trust is super important and super helpful, and it also helps with bad practices of users like getting their device and putting password 12345 6 on it, right? Like zero trust usually implies that they're
Right.
logging in with their IDP credentials in sort of a single sign-on type fashion, and they get the box drop shipped, and they don't have to set anything up; it just works. So,
Yeah.
From a zero trust perspective, I think that really helps.
Definitely. And it's you know, to me again, zero trust has always been I mean, it's a term being used more now, but at the end of the day, it's really a matter of understanding. If you look at your network traffic and application traffic as transactions, right? And you're going to say, okay, for every one of these transactions, there should be between trusted source and destinations, right? Um, and so, you know, it really boils down to that, right? I think it's kind of a term that we've been using more now than, you know, but the concept of it has always been there.
Yeah. Here's another good question. There's two. I see a question from Kip that I really want to get to, and then a question from Maurice. So the Maurice question is, what is your view on the importance of defense in depth approach? For example, is it more important to be mainly looking at external facing items mainly, or internal stuff not so much, database patching, or only looking at certain portions of the kill chain?
Back to what you said before. It's really a matter of balancing, right? I mean, again, these are some nice terminology that we use. It's really layers. Obviously, defense in depth is really all about layering security in such a way where if something happens, again, whether it's on the external network, internal network, the application itself, host specific data, whether it's physical, so it's really a matter of making sure you're addressing all of these layers. And again, it's always very specific to the organization when it comes to what you're doing in defining as defensive depth, right? You have to first define what, based on the architecture that you're using, what is the footprint of all, and then that applies to every aspect of your architecture, from policy management and operations to data security, application security, endpoint security, network security, so perimeter security. But it's a matter of balancing that, right? You know your network better than anyone to define what that defense in depth would mean, right, for each one of those layers.
Yeah, I would say just because something's internal only, or the perspective that is internal only, tends to make us a little bit more slack or lenient towards the security around it. And I would just say be careful with that, because sometimes we think things are internal and we were told things are internal, but then, you know, there's some way to connect external that people didn't know about, and as a result, like, you weren't
Well,
securing
and the biggest
same
breaches, Nicholas, have happened as a result of internal access, right?
Yeah.
Just because we think it's not reachable from the internet, or so we perceive that means that it's not reachable, right? And so we
Yeah,
get a
you
little
have,
bit more lax.
like, there's
But
an
that's not.
entire,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, go, I'll go. But
No, you were going there, Nathan.
there's an entire like aspect of like physical security as well. There's people who actually do physical pen testing, and which involves just like social engineering your way inside of a company, basically, without like accessing external networks or anything like that. Just like
Mm-hmm.
looking like you belong there and that you know what you're doing, and then next thing you know, you're inside like someone's like internal Active Directory control domain controller.
Well,
So
we've had. I mean, I can tell you personally of myself and other friends getting into a bank,
yeah,
pretending to be tech support, and being led into where the tellers are.
it's
You know.
extremely easy, and there's people who do that for fun illegally, and I know
Mm-hmm.
people who have done that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's that isn't like that sort of should lead you to believe that just because something is internal doesn't mean it is not something that you should pay attention to, or as much as things that are external facing.
In fact, I would argue sometimes that, your biggest threat is more internal than it is external, right? Because
Mm,
number one, from an impact perspective, some of the biggest cases that I've handled, um, have been as a result of somebody who is internal getting hacked. So it wasn't even that the person even is aware of it, right? Um, and then everything's coming from that person's device, right?
Yep.
Or literally, like, again, some of the worst impact cases I've had to deal with have been as a result of an insider, being mad, and just wanting to get back at their employer, right?
yeah.
I had a case where an entire financial organization, like investment fund type folks,
Hmm.
had everything, and I do mean everything, gone because one of their ex-IT people literally knew he was going to get fired because he was reading emails, and he prepared for it. And he prepared for it in such a way where he just ran a few scripts the day he was told to leave, and even backups were corrupted. So nothing. These people had zero. Within a matter of hours, they had access to do nothing. Not be able to work, not be able to get an email, nothing. Everything had been corrupted, and even going back. So, and that was an insider. So the threat is oftentimes even scarier, and its impact can be even bigger if it's an insider. So keep your eyes on the inside.
Yeah, and that goes like into the next question Kip asked, which is like, when a lot of it is insiders. I think a lot of the major breaches that happened um, this year and last year were insiders. But without to say names, like the question Kip asked is, with all the surge and interest in cryptocurrency space lately, have you guys seen more advanced and creative attacks in the past year or so towards Macs and iPhones with direct intent of financial damaging, e.g., ransomware? Are there 100% way? Are there 100% way for users to keep banking wallets details safe on these devices outside of 2FA or biometrics?
Well, first of all, there's not 100% way of anything anywhere, even with
Right.
all those things.
I was
But
gonna say.
yeah, there's no such thing. And the thing is, it tends to be a lot of those type of financially motivated, directly motivated crypto type hacks tend to be more of fooling the user than actually, it's not really hacking the tech behind crypto. It really tends to be more. I mean, there's been a few cases where the wallets had vulnerabilities, right? Or the wallet software had a vulnerability that allowed for certain things to take place. But generally speaking, it tends to be something where the user's fooled into giving their private,
Yeah.
You see all these like NFT heists, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
millions and millions of dollars worth of them, like big exchanges. Like I know the Bored Ape Yacht Club had a situation like that very recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they had like a $400,000 ape stolen.
I mean, it sounds stupid. It sounds stupid, but like these are like people are putting real money into this stuff.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
like
Yeah, and to your point, Nicholas, earlier about how it even happens to tech people, I have a very good friend who's a well-known tech writer for very big magazines, and he got hacked. You know, he
Yeah.
got fooled.
mhm.
So yeah, I mean, it's now whether it's specific to Mac or no, it's actually more tends to be more specific to the application platform, right? To the wallet itself, that layer
Yeah.
of software. It rarely is anything that is targeting Mac OS or iOS specifically.
Yeah. There was if there's a really good podcast. I'm gonna plug it. It's called uh, Darknet Diaries, and they just came out with an episode recently called Dirty Comms, and they specifically talk about this right here that Kip asked, where essentially like the latest tactics that they have that these people are doing, and it's through a series of middlemen, but essentially they call it they essentially run into a T-Mobile store, steal the T-Mobile manager's iPad, which has the ability to control whose SIM is activated where. They take that iPad and essentially they're essentially SIM jacking
Mm-hmm.
people. So there was
Yeah.
like a vulnerability in Coinbase or one of these cryptocurrency platforms that show like who was the biggest, whose accounts had the most funds. And with that, they were able to then determine, who they need to hack, who they need to go into the T-Mobile stores, steal the iPad, reallocate the
Mm-hmm.
SIM, and then they can essentially just bypass 2FA. So even if you do have 2FA, one, I would make sure you're not using text-based 2FA, right? Because like this isn't even a software problem, right?
Right.
That's just a company problem. The fact that they can do this, and um, the podcast is called Darknet Diaries. I'll actually link this episode, and the kid is there talking about how they do this and how much they charge per phone provider. So if you're on like, I think they said AT&T was the cheapest, which is $1,000 for someone to go do this for you. And I think they said like Sprint or um, uh, one of these other ones was like up to $10,000 for someone to go do a remote grab is what they
Yeah.
called it. And like this is the extent that they're going to steal this, because like let's be frank, like most of the time if you do this against a real bank, there's going to be real consequences and repercussions. When you're
Yep.
doing this
Yep.
in the crypto world, there's not as much, right? They talk about the consequences and repercussions in certain cases, but it's a lot harder and it's not as regulated, and as such like
It's not reversible either.
it's a
No.
bigger
Exactly.
target, right? Yeah, it's not
It's not
reversible.
reversible either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, that reaches, I think, most of the questions we have. I'm gonna put the podcast that I just mentioned in the chat, and the Q&A. But is there any other questions, comments, concerns, things you want us to talk about? We'll be here for another 5-10 minutes. If so, let me make sure we answered all the questions we got beforehand. All right, we'll give it 5 more minutes till 4:10 to see if we get any more questions. We're just going to finish off with one last question here, and this is going to be for Ralph. This is I think this one can vary, obviously, but what is the average time it takes you to get into different systems, and how many layers of security do you have to beat?
Oh well, that largely depends on the target. really, really depends on what you're targeting. Like I said, take for example, in today's environment, most of what you're going after is data specifically. So getting to the database is usually what you want, so you can pull down whatever data, right? And there's so many different ways to potentially do that, right? And so, if you're talking about getting to that database server by its as far as its operating system, then there's multiple layers you got to get through to get down there. That's usually not the lowest hanging fruit. Obviously, through SQL injection attacks or something more at the application layer that you're trying to extract information from. But it really depends, right? To Nathan's point, what if it's I need to get into this company, and I've done this as I've gone and pretended to work there and waited till the till the cleaning crew was coming in and pretended to have left my keys and walked in, and now I'm on the inside, right? So at that point you've got access to everything from the inside. So it really all depends on what it is to target. Something can take very little time. It can take very little time. You can run a scan of your target environment and immediately find a vulnerability that hasn't been addressed, and use that and get access through layers of security. Or it could be something that's very well tightened and that you can only access if you get in through another method. You can't do it from the outside. So it really is, there's no quick answer to that. It really depends on what your target is.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Carrie actually brought up I've asked if we talked about his comments, and his comment was like, it was going back to like Mac OS and how they're making things more secure and privacy oriented. And his comment was, that doesn't make sense in the enterprise. If it's BYOD, I totally see the privacy concern. When an enterprise pays for the equipment, it's a company privacy issue, not a user privacy issue.
Well, yes and no. Okay, and this has been we can argue till we're blue in the face. The issue of privacy is not a corporate or company or whatever government specific. It's an international one. We define privacy as being, there are international issues around the term privacy. Now, to your point, we have never defined the meaning of privacy in the digital space. We have never done that. I always like to use the analogy that we have defined privacy in a physical space to a degree. For some reason, okay, and excuse my French, if you want to take a shit, there happens to be a wall around it. We define it that. And by the way, you're not doing anything wrong. We all do it. But for that specific activity, we've defined that usually should be behind closed doors. And so we've defined that as a private thing, right? And we've defined several others as a private thing, but we have never done that. We have never even built a bathroom for digital privacy, right? We've never said that giving up your name is a privacy issue. We've never said that giving up your email address is a privacy issue. One of the first things that I look at, in, for example, doing a pen test against a company is just look at their email address. They tend to give it to you in their business card, right? Chances are that's the username on the network, right? For access to things. So they're giving away their username. If it's they're using first initial of their first name and last name, that's the username, right? So we've never defined that what is exactly should be private. Is your social security number private? Because I've been around the world in places where, for example, in Estonia, it is kind of perceived that a lot of things are very public as far as public record, things that we wouldn't do here. Even for example, do you think your bank account number should be private? Most of us here, based on the way that we tend to use bank accounts here, will say yes, that's a private piece of information. Is it? No. In many other parts of the world, you give that out. You don't use apps. You use your bank account number. Hey, I literally went to a heavy metal concert, okay, in the middle of nowhere in Estonia one time, and I ran out of cash, and my daughter was with me and said, "Oh, yeah, just go ask Homie over there. He brought some cash. I just went up to the guy and said, "Hey, dude, you got €100 on you? Okay, great. I'm going to send it to you right now." And I sent it from my bank account to his bank account in Estonia. Right? It's the bank account number was shared. I used a dude as an ATM. So, but here we would say that that's a personally identifiable piece of data, right? So we have never defined it on international, even though we use the word privacy on an international basis. We've never defined that on a personal level. Now take that to the corporate of what you just said. If it's a corporate machine, it's up to them. Not entirely either. There isn't enough precedence, legal precedence, to say that a company could take your private information, even though it was happening while you were at work. Can you log into your bank account from your computer at work? Yes. That's not your company's. They don't own the password because you happen to log into your bank account from that machine.
Yeah,
So I mean, and
I'm
this
gonna
goes
step
back
in.
to, I mean, there's even again, there's no real necessarily, there's not clear legal precedence on this matter, but there was, going sometimes, somewhat back, is that I remember that the creator of Perl, the Perl scripting language, used to work, I think Larry Wall used to work at Intel, I think it was. This is one of the, you know, founders of many of the things that we do for the internet, right? And Larry used to work, I think it was at Intel. And, he was able to look at the password. So he basically wrote a Perl script that would go and check the strength of passwords of the users at Intel. And he got fired for that. Okay? That is a violation of the people's privacy. Has nothing to do even with corporate specifics. Yes, a system administrator could look at people's passwords at that time, right? But does that mean you can or should? No, right? So he got fired from Intel for doing that, while he was actually thinking he was doing something good by writing something that would pull passwords out to check password strength. So, I mean, this is a gray area about whether or not something, the word privacy and corporate, in that world, again, we haven't even defined it in the non-corporate world. So it gets a little gray as to.
Yeah, I'm gonna step in. And Carrie sent a bunch of messages you can't see, Ralph, but it's probably for the best because I'm gonna try and be Carrie's voice here now. Uh, what I'll say is that they are corporate devices and they are corporate owned, right? Like, I don't think Apple has done stuff that really like hinders the company's ability to manage the device. I will say they have done some things that may prevent people from a breach of one's privacy, right? Like, I can't just connect to their computer and watch what they're doing on the screen.
Mm-hmm,
But if they
mm-hmm.
are fired, to like the analogy of the story of, like, the guy that knew he was going to get fired, like, we can lock that device. He can't do anything with that device. Now, once we get that device back, if we ever get that device back from the said employee, we have the PIN, we can go in, we can reset the password, we can access anything that was on the machine because it is corporate owned machine. Everything on there should be corporate data, whether he followed, the EULA, the company EULA or whatever, right? Is debatable, and sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes, like, they have their own, important personal information that they ask you to get
Mm-hmm.
off their machine or whatever. But like, in the grand scheme of things, that is company data that shouldn't be touched. But there is an aspect of user privacy that they're trying to balance along with the corporate device ownership mentality that we all have. And there are some things you can do if the device is an Apple Business Manager versus not, and definitely things you can't do versus BYOD, right? So I think
Right.
I'm just gonna say both of you guys are right, and we'll just leave it at that because there are a couple questions that I wanna get to here, that just came in, and I don't know how much time we have. We're already 15 minutes over, so I just want to be cognizant of time. But how easy is it to get past SSO? What are the main misconfigurations here?
I don't know. What do you think on that one? Then we'll let Nathan start with that.
I have some good ones, but Nathan, if you want to start, I can start if you want.
I don't know.
All
I
right,
haven't
so
messed with SSO that much personally.
I have more than I would like to admit. But usually misconfigurations in SSO aren't like the person setting it up usually. Usually the misconfigurations are with the
That's
vendor who built the SSO
the IDP.
implementation,
Yeah.
or the libraries that they're using for their SSO implementation. We use a tool internally, many security researchers do as well, called Burp Suite. They actually have a really cool plugin that you may want to check out called SAML Raider. And what
Yeah.
that does
Yeah.
is allows you to test SSO for different permutations that might be vulnerable. And I guess that's probably all we're going to say about that. Like, other than that, it's really like how, it's easy to get past SSO if the email account gets compromised, right?
Yeah.
Because usually
Yeah.
SSO is dictated by the email. I mean, but in the grand scheme of things, like, if email's compromised, they can get access to almost anything if there's no MFA. If there is MFA, let's hope it's not email-based MFA, because then it's really kind of pointless anyways and doesn't do much.
Yeah, I mean, most of, if there's any, it's usually an attacks is against the SAML sector, or, vector, the markup language that's implemented in XML, and that stuff is, it's base 64 encoded, so it could easily be decoded, and it tends to be misimplementation, right?
Yeah.
A mistake in the implementation. It rarely is anything but that.
Yeah.
Your valid signature, missing signature, things of that nature. But it all applies to that XML vulnerability.
Yeah. SAML Reader makes it really easy to test for a lot of different kinds of misconfigurations in SAML.
It's a very good tool. Like, I would say, the tool for that.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So last question here, we'll call it after this, 420 here. So this is actually something in the podcast that they talk about that they have services for, but I'm curious to see what you guys think. When an individual steals a database with usernames and passwords, what do they do with that information? One person cannot possibly use thousands of different usernames and passwords of information or pieces of information in an efficient way.
They can.
Yeah.
They can take that input and use it as, they can take that output, if you will, and use it as input for automating further attacks, for sure. But in my experience, especially if it's, in most cases, they have value. I mean, even going back to the days of, with spam, there was email addresses that were being sold, not access to them, but just the email addresses. So it tends to be something that then nowadays is being sold on the deep web. Just, hey, I've got this database has this many records. These are the records, and but it's for people to buy it, so for whatever reasons, right?
Yep.
But that's the most common.
Yep, 100%. The episode, Dirty Comms episode, they talk about this too. It's mainly about, like, it starts off with Roblox and how they're like scamming little kids with Roblox and making hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if your kids plays Roblox, and you want to check it out too. But what they essentially do with these databases is at least what they talk about in the podcast is one, they have tools and services that help them scrape through the data. So it's not one person manually going through this data. But two, they're looking for emails and passwords across different databases. So they'll buy like 3 or 4 databases and say, oh, look, I'm using the same password in multiple different platforms. That password is probably similar to something he's using for his professional work life, right? And that's usually how they kind of correlate who they should attack versus who they shouldn't attack, and who may be reusing passwords that may be applicable to their company. Because to Ralph's point, right, like if I have someone's personal email, it's really easy to find someone's personal email, find their LinkedIn, and say, oh, now I know where they work. Now I know what the company's email structure looks like: first name, last name at company.com, first name at company.com, last name, first name, etc. It's really easy for these guys. They built tools, they have services that they use. Unfortunately, it's become more of a more of a prevalent thing than it used to be, where we were just selling emails. Now they're selling legitimate emails and passwords, and trying to craft other vectors of attacks that are really, really creative, which is kind of how we ventured down this conversation, where it's like the attack vectors are definitely gotten a lot more creative and clever throughout the years, and will continue to do so. And that's part of why we wanted to have this conversation, where, you know, you can ask us anything, because we're always learning from you as well. And I hope you guys get some value out of this session, so that like we can all educate all of the users we have to do, and, you know, teach them to use password managers and SSO and MFA and et cetera, which is always a challenge. It's always a challenge. All right. I think that concludes all the questions we got right now. If I missed one and we didn't answer it, please let us know. All right. Well, with that said, yeah, thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Nathan, for your time today.
Thank you,
thank
Nicholas.
for
Thank you,
joining.
Nathan.
Thank you.
And thank everyone who joined us today. And you know, we look forward to speaking with you again. If you have any other questions, then jot them down and make sure that that you raise them on our next upcoming events.
Yeah, there's a sudo talks in 2 weeks. Another one, identity management for Macs, going beyond Active Directory. We just talked about Active Directory quite a bit, but you know, if you need to remove Active Directory, you want to see how you can implement a better solution than Active Directory on your Macs, check it out. May 10th, 3 p.m. Eastern. You can register at addigy.com/events. Thank you again for everybody for joining. Everybody have a great day, night, week, whatever
time zone.
All right.
Thank you,
guys.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.